Did the Milwaukee Bucks cost themselves a seed already with their performance over the weekend? Camille Davis and I dig into a lost weekend for the Bucks next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I am Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis, and we thank you for making this your first listen of the day and for checking out the Locked On Bucks newsletter. Free and available every single day. All you have to do is sign up at lockedondaily.com. LockedOnDaily.com to get your day started with the all-new free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Camille, been a couple of days since we last spoke. The Bucks played Saturday night in Chicago, and for the second consecutive game, this was a rough fourth quarter for the Bucks. And I think the caveat is this. You did get Damian Lillard back, but you had just played 4 straight games without him. You had played 2 straight games without Dame and Giannis, and now you've played 4 straight without Giannis as well. So it wasn't 100% there, but one of the strengths that we saw from the Bucks during the foundational parts of the turnaround was they were really good in clutch. Now, granted, those numbers aren't always fully sustainable, and a lot of it can be fool's gold. But that's been the big difference against 2 teams the Bucks could have easily beaten, and certainly if they were full strength, should have beaten. But these were winnable games that ultimately slipped away in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, 2 winnable games that the Bucks have dropped here. Was hoping to come here. You know, ideally, if everything would have worked well, the Bucks would be sitting at 18-12 right now. But unfortunately, after the loss to the Nets and now to the Bulls, they're 16-14, looking at that 6th seed in the East right now. Again, a lot of basketball left to be played for the Milwaukee Bucks, but disappointing. And I think in that Bulls game in particular, what really stood out to me was just at the beginning of the game, how physical the Bulls were. I believe the paint points after one quarter was like 20-2 in favor of the Bulls.
Yeah.
It was just, they exerted their will early. They set the tone physically, and they kept playing through that. I mean, Josh Giddey had a great game against the Bucks in that game against the Bulls of Chicago, but yet and still, like it's just one of those games where you look at how everything was going. You have Dame coming back off to a slow start, but in the fourth quarter really helped turn things around for the Bucks. You saw points in the game earlier with Khris Middleton and Bobby Portis having little personal runs of their own to keep the Bucks connected. It just wasn't enough overall. And really the defense for the Bucks just wasn't as sharp as we have been seeing from them. You could look and say, hey, like you're missing Giannis, understand, but this is a Bulls team that we just saw this Bucks team beat last week.
Yeah, and, you know, this one, I think what's especially tough is I don't want to get into the, well, who's more valuable, Giannis or Damian Lillard, but against a team like the Bulls, Giannis's importance was really twofold because you mentioned the points in the paint early. It was an area that the Bulls, I wouldn't say dominated, but consistently won. In that game against the Bucks, I think they ended up outscoring the Bucks by only a couple of points.
Yeah, even that wasn't went on.
Yeah, but the thing is, Giannis creates so much on both ends for the Bucks there that it's a Bulls team. The second half of that game especially felt a lot like the second half of the first game we saw between these 2 teams when the Bulls were just getting paint touches, spraying it out to shooters, scoring in the paint as well. It wasn't as much the 3-point shooting this time, just getting into the paint and converting from there. You miss Giannis by not having a second rim protector and not making that even more difficult for the Bulls, especially difficult in the minutes when Brook Lopez was off the floor. You miss Giannis in winning those paint numbers and getting his production there as well. So it's tough to take large takeaways from these 2 games, given you didn't have either guy against the Brooklyn Nets. You didn't have Giannis against the Chicago Bulls. But the tough parts is those were winnable games. It would be one thing if, you know, let's say the Nets game, you didn't have Giannis and Damian Lillard and Brooklyn came out and hit shots, which they did as the game went on, but was just firmly in control. And you could see the Bucks just don't have the horses tonight. Brooklyn gave you every opportunity, even down the stretch with the way that they played late with an early shot. bailing you out with some of their offensive sets. They gave you every chance to win that. The Bulls did the same thing. And I was a little leery going into this game, especially if Dame was going to miss as well, because there's no way to quantify this, Camille, but the Chicago Bulls were probably not going to let the Bucks without Giannis and Dame come in there and beat them for the second consecutive game in that scenario in less than a week. So you knew the Bulls were up for it in that sense and didn't want to provide that letdown, especially given what they did against the Atlanta Hawks with that 50-point quarter they gave up in the fourth their last time. But it just came down to the execution for winnable games. And I mentioned at the open of the show, did you cost yourself a seed line? I mean, maybe it's a little hyperbolic, but the fact of the matter is these are the types of games that ultimately decide that. So you lost this winnable game. You got to get a game back out somewhere else. And especially when you see the teams around the Bucks, Magic still going through some issues now with the injuries, but teams have started to consistently play better, not to the level of the Celtics, who have also gone through struggles, and Cavs, but the mid parts of the Eastern Conference is starting to stabilize and normalize. And like, these are the games. I'm not saying you can't have any of these. It's only natural. And I do want to revisit, as we see some of the comments, some of Doc's thoughts in the presser afterwards, but you can't let these pile up. And these were 2 straight games, basically same scenario at that point in the fourth quarter with the way you had played previously. Doesn't matter who was off the floor. These are games you should have won.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with you on that one. And it makes me think maybe we can dive into this a bit more in the next segment, but do you think the Bucks are experiencing like a NBA Cup hangover for the team right now? Just the high of going into that situation, going for that cup, getting everything that comes with that, and then coming out of that game and having as many games as they have had, in the short period of time. In addition to that, you have Giannis missing the games, you have Dame missing the game. So the games are inherently going to be more difficult when you're missing 2 of your top players. But there was a lot, riding on Vegas. They really wanted to get that win. Yeah. I don't personally think there's anything wrong with them putting that goal out to try to get that NBA Cup championship and going for it. But do you think there might be some hangover for the Bucks coming out of that? I could look at that myself and say, like, well, the Thunder haven't lost since they've come back from Vegas. Again, different situations around the Bucks with who's been available and who has not been available. But do you think that there's anything to a Vegas hangover?
I think it'd be a lot easier to answer if this team has been fully healthy. Now, I guess what would support, if you're on the side that thinks yes, is, even that game against the Wizards where it was, okay, we didn't play the Cavs with Dame and it's coming off of the cup. So you would imagine there's going to be a little bit of a hangover there. But even night 2 of a back-to-back, the way that game went Friday night, it should have been, all right, let's come out and set the tone here. You beat the Wizards, but it took a little bit to get there in that game. So I do think we have to see, I don't even want to say an extended runway, because as we've learned the last year and a half, who knows if that's even possible, but we need to see some time with those 3 guys all on the floor together to start to formulate that clear opinion on how much of the cup is this, what we're seeing so far with this group. There is one other thing that stood out, and not just in these last 2 games, but it's been notable this past week, and that's the performance of some of the Bucks role players since one specific day when Khris Middleton came back to the floor. So I want to dive into those numbers because there's been some interesting shooting splits that we've seen from a handful within this group. We'll get into that conversation coming up next here on Locked On Bucks. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Rocket RX. If you're ready to boost your confidence and take control in the bedroom, Rocket RX has the solution. Imagine feeling more prepared and performing at your best. Rocket RX makes it simple and stress-free. Rocket RX offers FDA-approved treatments for erectile dysfunction at a lower cost than branded alternatives. No more uncomfortable doctor visits or pharmacy trips. Everything is delivered straight to your door in discreet, plain packaging. With Rocket RX, you'll get trusted care from a real U.S. clinical team. Complete a quick 100% online consultation, and you could get your free prescription today. Visit rocketrx.com to get started now. It only takes 2 minutes. Right now, our listeners can get 40% off your first order when you use the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's rocketrx.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for 40% off your first order. Terms and conditions apply. Rocket RX, better sex made simple. So some of these shooting splits, Camille, is what has really stood out to me. And I think it's easy to key in on one player, which you've started to see more and more of. But let's just level set here.
Mhm.
Before Khris Middleton came back, the day before it, the shooting splits for this group, it was starting to pick up as a team. You had AJ Green shooting 46% on threes. Gary Trent Jr. was up to 39%, which was remarkable given the start he went through. Taurean Prince was an NBA league leading 56%. And I've heard a lot of Bucks just have everybody shooting well. That's part of the turnaround. When the reality is still they just had two guys shooting over 40%. They had guys getting close, but those numbers were starting to stabilize. The guy that had taken the most threes through those first roughly 20 games was Damian Lillard with 167 three-point attempts, far and away most on the team. Brook Lopez at 114. Again, he's another one of those guys starting to stabilize at 36%. And then you had Derry Bird, the only other player with more than 100 three-point attempts. Since Khris Middleton has returned, I think you know where this is headed, and I don't think it's surprising. Damian Lillard, 34% shooting. The caveat there, he was 38% going in. He's played in 5 games, I think, since then. So that's a tough comp. Gary Trent Jr. above 40% on 45 tries. Bobby Portis above 40% on 43 tries. AJ Green, not where he was, but high 30s on 42 tries. Brook Lopez, 43% as well. Even Khris Middleton's been very good since his return. But it all leads us to one player, and that is Taurean Prince, who has taken 29 threes in the 9 games he's played since Khris Middleton has come back. He took 81 threes in the 21 games that he played prior. So if you just extrapolate it out, he's not getting up as many looks per minute. He's playing about 8 or 9 fewer minutes a game. And I think what we're seeing, and a lot of us were a little unsure about, was how is this going to impact what you're seeing from Taurean Prince? Because in some ways it was like the Jay Crowder situation a year ago where he came out lighting it up with his 3-point shooting, suffers the injury earlier in the season. He was never the same. I think there's a better chance that Taurean Prince bounces back. But I think it's pretty clear the adjustment of, okay, Khris is back. You're off to the bench now. You're playing fewer minutes. You're not playing, especially these last few games, the importance of catch and shoots with Taurean Prince. You're not playing with Dame. You're not playing with Giannis. Not just in those full games, but fewer minutes with that group. Mm-hmm. It seems to have been a mixture of all of that we're seeing right now. The Taurean Prince, again, has been a 20% 3-point shooter in a third of the season now since Khris Middleton's return.
I think pointing out the minute allocation and who he has been on the court with is a big point of what you're seeing with Taurean Prince. I mean, the other piece of it is I don't think anyone expected for Taurean Prince to sustain being a 56% shooter from 3, given the fact that prior to this season, he had only had 1 season where he shot over 40% from 3 throughout the entire year. He came close last year, shooting 39.6%. So like you can expect him to shoot in the upper 30s from 3 based on how the last few seasons have gone for him. But he's been in a slump over the last few games. I mean, the game that he makes his return to, or that Khris Middleton makes his return to, is the game where Taurean Prince was also sick. And he tried to play in that Celtics game, but he only managed to get 9 minutes in that game before he had to come out and just like, I can't go too much longer with this one. And then since then, as you've mentioned, the minutes have just been a little bit lower for him. The shot attempts for him in the month of December, he's been averaging almost the same amount of threes as he was in the month of November. It was 3.9 in November, 3.5 so far in the month of December. So like he's still getting them up. They're just not falling at the same clip that they were previously. He's been shooting just about 32% from 3 in this month. And to me, it's more so of a thing like it's just some shooting regression. And I think you can attribute that the regression to, the touches that he's been getting. Are the looks as wide open as they were previously? But I do think that he will start shooting a bit better than what we have seen from him so far this month. As the season continues to go on, he continues to get used to his new role coming off the bench and gets used to playing minutes with a different rotation than what he's been accustomed to start the season.
Yeah, and I want to point this out too. I mean, he's been very consistent this year, and I'm sure there's a number of Lakers fans that are already ready to go with EC. We told you, but it was the first 13 or 14 games this season that he hit at least 1 3. Half of those were multiple threes. I mean, it felt like early in the season you could bank on Taurean Prince hitting 2 to 3 threes per game. He had a bit of a rough stretch for a couple of games right around the start of the Cup, but he was pretty good in those final games of the NBA Cup. He had a good game in Charlotte against the Hornets. We mentioned that game against the Wizards the day after Thanksgiving, or 2 days or so after, when you saw a little bit more of the malaise of this group coming off some extended time off. Taurean Prince was one of the best players on the floor. That it just kind of coincides, all of this. Any way you slice the numbers, his splits are fairly consistent. I mean, as you pointed, we don't expect 56 to 57% from Taurean Prince. But if you look at this in any type of 9-game chunk or 10-game, as Billy Donovan has been one of those proponents, he's pretty consistently 38, 39, 40% three-point shooter for this group or better. It just all lines up with that game that Khris made his return. And that's the thing that gets lost in the shuffle too, is what you pointed out with the illness. We did not see him at all in the second half. But he went 0 of 2 his next game out against the Nets. 0 of 1, only 1 shot attempt. That was the one that stood out the most to me in that quarterfinal game against the Orlando Magic, where he played 20 minutes but only got up 1 3-point attempt, 2 of 7 after that in the semifinals against the Hawks. That it wasn't until that Nets game, which you did lose, but Taurean Prince went 3 of 6, and you felt like, okay, starting to come back now, that maybe it was the illness, maybe it's fewer minutes with Giannis and Dame, but you felt pretty good that Thursday was he's starting to pull out of this, and then you get an offer in Chicago. So I don't want to make too much out of one game and whether or not we see him start to find that stroke again, but I think that is probably one of the more interesting things to keep an eye on. Is just, does that number start to tick upward again? Certainly it can't be in the 20s, but where is the water realistically setting at for Taurean Prince with his 3-point shooting? And what is the biggest culprit? Is it the minutes? Is it the role? Is it the fewer minutes without Giannis and Damian Lillard on the floor? Because in games where you don't have Giannis and Dame, you need somebody else, and not just one guy. You need multiple guys to give you that punch. And I think that's why it stood out more so these past couple of games. Not only that 20% split, but the fact that you really needed it from a guy like Taurean Prince or Gary Trent Jr., which you got against the Nets. Any of those guys consistently without Giannis and Dame, and it just hasn't been there of late. So it's not time to panic, as we said, but something to file away and keep an eye on here in these next couple games. One more game this calendar year against the Indiana Pacers. It is an afternoon game tomorrow on New Year's Eve, and it's a Pacers team, Camille, that has been playing much, much better. So we'll take a look at that matchup and revisit some of those clutch numbers that we referenced, but didn't give the full context as we wrap things up after this on Locked On Bucks. The Indiana Pacers, Camille, are going to enter this game against the Bucks with a chance to basically not pull even, but pull within a half game of them and get back to 500 on the season. You mentioned the Bucks have dropped down to 6th now in the East, with the Atlanta Hawks winning 6 of their last 10 games. The New York Knicks, feels like this is the point where they start to separate themselves from that chunk of the rest of the East. And that's why I mentioned the 2 games that you drop to the Nets and the Bulls. That's where it can come back to haunt you. When you look at, man, it was these types of games that you drop, and you look back in the end of the season where you finish a game back of the Knicks and think, well, that was our chance that night where you could have won that game and pulled even. So I don't want to make too much out of games in December, but there is some meaning there. Those count in the standings, and especially with the Knicks playing much more consistently. Last week, we had the conversation of, hey, one of the benefits of this is the Cavs remain really good. You're not catching the Cavaliers, so let's just let go of that thought. The Celtics, still pretty good. You're probably not catching the Celtics. And then Boston started to experience some issues where they've been 500 in the last 10 games. But nobody else is really doing anything here. The Bucks, I think, were 7-3 at our last check-in in their last 10. The Sixers were doing the same. It was just the Cavs and Celtics. Everybody else was around 500. So that's how you were able to keep stacking wins and climbing in the standings. And now you've shifted into that group as the Bucks are now 5-5 in their last 10 games. And again, a major asterisk applied with no Giannis and Damian Lillard. But when that's what the rest of the conference is doing, that's what puts even more importance on win these games that you have a chance to win. And Brooklyn would have been perfectly fine with losing that game, especially given they've continued to sell off parts in the recent days now.
Yeah, they have. I say it often, like the players want to get those wins, and you saw that when the Brooklyn Nets were playing against the Bucks, just how the players were into that game, the celebrations. They really wanted that win. Now, the front office might not have, but the players definitely did. And now here you come against a Pacers team to end 2024. As you mentioned, a 2 p.m. tip-off time for the Bucks and the Pacers. And the Pacers team that has been playing some pretty good ball. They just got a win over the Celtics after getting blown out by the Celtics. And
Tyrese Halliburton's best game of the year, hands down, too.
Absolutely. And they're just starting to click a little bit better. They're getting a little bit healthier, the Pacers are, and they're finding their way, which it was a question there for a while. It's like, are the Pacers, the 2021 Hawks and so on and so forth, where you had a good year and then you come back and it's just not the same magic that you had the prior year. But a biggest driver for the Pacers has just been Tyrese Halliburton. And it's like, if he can look how he had looked prior last year before he got injured, the ceiling for the Pacers was a lot higher. So you're getting a Pacers team that's been playing some better ball. They're 7-3 over their last 10 games. So, they're ready to play. We understand what's going on between the Bucks and the Pacers now after last year's events and how these two teams feel about each other. So it's going to be highly charged as well. And for me, looking at it, it's like, just do what you got to do to try to get this win and keep climbing in the standings. Because as you've mentioned, a lot of teams in the East have been playing 500 ball or worse. It's just been a couple of teams that have been outside of that parameter, with the Pacers being one of them. So this could be a really good win to end the year for the Bucks if they're able to pull that one off.
Yeah, an important win too, because you don't want to pile up these losses. You don't want to be on a 3-game losing streak going into the new calendar year. Doc Rivers, mentioned this a number of times, and he said it again essentially after that game against the Bulls, in that these recent struggles, there's things to look at from them, but this doesn't define what we've done since our first 10 games of the season. But he was very critical of his team after the game on Saturday night. And I think it's notable because we heard a lot of the same critique against the Brooklyn Nets after that game on Thursday night, where, he came out after that game and said, look, we knew what we wanted to do. We didn't execute. And that was kind of the story all night. We had a lot of miscues. The Nets gave us opportunities, but we didn't execute down the stretch of the fourth quarter. We, reading between the lines, played terribly, but we haven't done that in quite some time. So there are some takeaways here. This isn't a burn the tape type of game. There's some takeaways and things to improve, but I know this isn't who this group is, because we haven't seen this since the first 10 games of the season. You followed it up with essentially the exact same script, and you could tell it was a more frustrated Doc Rivers on Saturday night, and especially the way that his team closed out that game, and saying, even when we were close, it felt like fool's gold that we were chasing, because they were doing everything better. They were getting in the paint. We didn't have solid rim protection. Our defense was getting beat at the point of attack. That's another thing you and I have talked about that we haven't seen a ton of. You saw it again against the Bulls on Saturday. So that's, to me, the biggest part of all of this. It's not a win or a loss per se, because look, if you lose 3 in a row, it's unfortunate. It's not the way you want to go into 2025. But as we mentioned at the 2-8 start, these things happen, and it might happen again this season. It's just coming in your first 10 games. I don't really care if they lose, but it can't be a fourth quarter like that. If you get Giannis and Damian Lillard back and you're executing, and the Pacers are playing better as well, you lose a game on the road in a charged environment against a team that's playing better in a competitive game, fine. But it can't be redos of not just the fourth quarter either, Camille, but what we've seen for large stretches of those past two games.
Yeah, I agree with that. And for the Bucks as well, it's coming out and starting the game off fast as well. We've seen the Bucks come into games where they kind of ease their way into it. And Doc Rivers has talked a lot about wanting this Milwaukee Bucks team to be a physical team. He understands the limitations that this Bucks team has with athleticism and a lack of youth, even though we have some guys in the rotation to help interject that. But overall, like your main guys, the big dogs here on the team, they're a bit older. So like come out, use the physicality and set the tone. And that's another aspect for this upcoming game against the Pacers that I'm really looking to see for the Bucks to do is start the game off fast. Come out and exert your will on them and set the tone for it, because we've also seen how refs tend to officiate games as well. The team that comes out and exerts their physicality, that sets the tone, they tend to get a little bit more of a favorable whistle as well going forward. So I just want to see the Bucks come out, start the game off fast, and then in the fourth quarter, also be able to wrap that game up. One thing we talked about with the Bulls win that they had last week was just how it felt like the Bucks were in control throughout that entire game, where even when the Bulls were threatening, the Bucks were going to have a response, and they continued to do so. And that wasn't the feeling that we got in this most recent game against the Bulls this past weekend, where it took until the third quarter for the Bucks to even get a lead in the game before it continued to go back and forth for the rest of the game. So want to see the Bucks come out, start off fast against the Pacers, and also just make sure they finish the game strong as well. Start and finish the game well.
Yeah, the start is especially going to be critical. And as we start to wrap here, you look at these two teams. They've been near identical in the month of December, Camille, as the Bucks obviously have one win that doesn't count, but they have gone 6-5 in their 11 games played, official games played in December. The Pacers 7-6, and they've done it as you would expect for what we've talked up about the Bucks this season and the Pacers as a whole. In December, number 10 in offensive rating. Not a similar story in defensive rating, where the Indiana Pacers are 19. So in the top 10 and essentially bottom 10 in defense for the month. And their net rating is 16. For the Bucks, they've been 9th defensively in the month of December, as we continue to say, look, this feels sustainable, that this group can threaten to be a top 10 defense. The issue for the Bucks, and again, 4 of those official games didn't have Giannis and or Damian Lillard, 5 of them, and 6 or 7 didn't have Khris Middleton. So you still haven't had your full deck offensively for an extended period of time, but the Bucks are 21st in offense in the month of December at a 110.3 offensive rating. I mean, look, we got more time to get into this as the season progresses, but that is obviously not going to be good enough for this group to get to where they need to go. The caveats of the injuries are one thing, but it just puts a lot of pressure on this group to say this offense has to be much better. Like we've reached the point, Camille, where we're saying, I almost expect this to be a top 10 defense. Can the offense be just a little better than league average?
Who would have thought that that's where you would end up at this point? But I mean, December has been a month where this is the month where Khris Middleton made his return. So we thought, or at least I know I said a few times, like it's going to be a little clunky to beginning with getting him back integrated into the lineup. So you might see some funky things happening there. In addition to that, as you've mentioned, we've had the Giannis and the Dame and now the lineup a bit. What I hope for in the year of 2025 is just more consistent health for the Bucks, so those big three can continue to get those reps in. We are recording this live right now, and as it seems to be in almost every live, a conversation about Khris Middleton appears in the comment section about his value and what he should be doing and if he's doing enough and so on and so forth. And I think the biggest thing for this Bucks team, again, is just getting those reps with Doc Rivers as their coach, because they just haven't had that much time, the three of them on the court together. And if we were depending on Khris Middleton to be the number 2 option for the Milwaukee Bucks, I'd feel a little bit more nervous about their prospects going forward. But when you slot him into that third option with Dame and with Giannis, I think that fits a lot better at this point in his career as well. So I just want to see this Bucks team be able to have some health and continue to get those reps in together, because we saw, as you point out, the numbers in December, not the same as we saw in November as they were trying to, starting to figure things out. So they just need some more time on the court together to figure it out, because this Bucks team should not be, past the bottom half in the league when it comes to their offensive rating and their offense in general. So they got to figure that part out and continue to get sharper on that end, because they have to be better on that end of the floor as well.
Yeah, I mean, as we've said many times, the conversation changed when you made the trade for Damian Lillard, that it alleviated some of the expectations for Khris Middleton offensively, because I get the concerns that are out there. It's a much different conversation if the way the team is built, Khris Middleton is still your number 2 primary scorer, which is not the case. So I think that's the grain of salt we have to take when analyzing any of this. But again, it means you got to see those 3 guys on the floor together, which we just have not seen of late for this group. As we wrap here, Camille, I know I mentioned it. I didn't give the actual numbers. So far this season in the clutch, an area they certainly struggled with in the last 2 games, the Bucks are still the 10th best defense in the clutch. So all these numbers that continue to pour in, of this feels like this is where this defense can really be at. But the offensive issues have been exacerbated in those minutes. And this is for the full season. 10th defensively, 27th offensively in the clutch. And look, all of that has to improve. The offense especially cannot be outside of ideally the top 10. As we've said, it should be better. But at this point, it's let's get to the mid-pack and start to build from there, because since Khris Middleton's return too, and this isn't just heaping everything on Khris, we've seen even more drop-off on both ends. 20th in the clutch in defensive efficiency and 22nd in offensive efficiency in 6 games that they played in those scenarios, which is 24th worst in the league. So it's baby steps, but that is one of the big things to look at and really start to improve here, is the offense and how the Bucks perform down the stretch of these games. That will do it for today's show. We'll have one more tomorrow to preview the matchup with the Bucks and the Indiana Pacers, and then a post-game show. So you're going to get 2 shows tomorrow as well, meaning we're going to take Wednesday off again for New Year's Day. But 2 shows to look forward to tomorrow. For Camille, I'm Justin. Thanks once again to everybody for tuning in. We will talk to you tomorrow once again on Locked On Bucks.